what is pancreatitis? It is inflammation of the pancreas. Really simple. So you've got two different forms of pancreatitis. You have acute pancreatitis and you have chronic pancreatitis, although I feel there are actually subsections of that. So acute pancreatitis is a sudden onset. It's much rarer actually. It's a sudden onset. It tends to come out of nowhere. It can be life-threatening, but normally it's just a really awful, very painful, cripplingly painful experience for your dog. But it tends to ease 2 or 3 days, and that inflammation will go back down to a degree. Normally there'll be a trigger for that pancreatitis, that acute attack. And normally with the acute, what happens is the enzymes that are released, and I'll talk about the pancreas and what it does, but the enzymes that are released, actually the pancreatic duct becomes really inflamed, and it can't, I guess there's not free flow of the enzymes that's meant to go into the duodenum in the small intestines. So it tends to back up, and then it almost wants to pre-digest the pancreas. So that obviously left or continuously happens is really quite awful. And then you've got chronic pancreatitis, which can then also lead on to EPI, which is actually exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. So chronic is more of a low-grade, consistent thing that happens for a much longer period of time. It's happening in the background whilst you're not even really aware of it. Onset doesn't normally happen till about 2 years onwards, but honestly I find with these things there are genuinely no set rules, but that probably is kind of about right. And then you generally find that it's something that will, as a low-grade chronic inflammation, will kind of exacerbate and be with your dog consistently, and there'll be times when, you know, they're much worse and they'll dip in and out of it, but ultimately that inflammation remains and it actually starts to produce less enzymes. And so exocrine pancreatic insufficiency is when they stop producing the enzymes that are actually required to help digest food. So the pancreas is an organ that sits behind the stomach and the intestines. It's also sometimes referred to as a gland because it releases hormones as well. But there's two parts to the pancreas. It's called the endocrine and the exocrine. So the exocrine is the bit that we're mostly talking about today, and the exocrine releases enzymes which are namely protease, lipase and amylase. So protease digests proteins, lipase digests lipase, and amylase digests carbohydrates. And a really big thing to know and understand is that dogs don't naturally produce much amylase. So whilst they might be opportunistic carnivores, they actually aren't set up to have a high dense carbohydrate diet into dry food. So really what we want to be looking at is the symptoms that might be there. They're not all, it's not an exhaustive list, and obviously if your animal has a few of these symptoms, then your dog doesn't necessarily have pancreatitis as such. But I often think there are a lot of animals that probably have low-grade inflammation. We won't call it pancreatitis, but there's some low-grade inflammation, and that's normally impacted from the intestines. Anyway, we'll come back to that. So there's another part of the pancreas that also produces hormones. There's glucagon, there's somatostatin, and the biggest one and most important one is insulin. So those are the two things that the pancreas does. So it works with blood sugar regulation and metabolism, mostly to do with blood sugar regulation, and it also produces those enzymes to help the digestive system digest the protein, fats and carbohydrates in food. So it's the same for dogs as it is for us. They just have a slightly different digestive system and obviously different nutritional needs. So the symptoms. when your dog's actually having an attack, it can be quite awful. So pacing, panting, you might get regurgitation or vomiting. They do this, like, you know, the hunched cat thing, or they might play bow. More sort of subtle stuff like, you know, consistently licking lips, licking the air, licking items. A lot of nausea can come about from the pancreatic flare. That can also, some of those symptoms can also be from IBS and IBD. But the pancreatitis can bring about real discomfort. So you would see a difference in your dog's behaviour quite drastically. They would definitely be in pain. Sometimes you might even hear them cry. The pacing and the panting is a really big thing. And one of the really obvious signs, and maybe this is more in chronic, is really voluminous stools, really big stools and lots of stools in a day, too much. And quite often a greasy stool, so fat metabolism isn't too great. But the idea is, in conventional medicine, is that pancreatitis should not be fed a high-fat diet, and that it is often to do with the fat constituent of a diet that exacerbates and makes this worse. Now, there are two reasons why, well, there are lots of reasons why, but there are two main reasons why. And when we look at the digestive system as a whole and how that works and how it works with the pancreas, because it's a unit, you know, when you talk to the vet, they'll give you a diagnosis of pancreatitis and maybe IBD, but actually they're very much two of the same thing. They're linked and they're happening for a particular reason, and we look at them like they're two separate entities. So generally what happens is within the digestive tract, so you have this one cell epithelial wall that goes all the way through your dog's digestive tract, and it produces mucin, lovely mucus that helps regulate lots of different reactions in the body. It regulates immunity. There should be really good bacteria that proliferates within that, and also we have a regulation of immune response from that mucin. Also within the stomach we have hydrochloric acid produced from that one cell epithelial wall. So this is where I think a lot of the issues start to come in. When inflammation ensues, and that can happen if your dog is experiencing digestive issues. So quite often if your dog has IBS, IBD, if you're seeing lots of diarrhea and so forth, quite often what's happening is inflammation occurs. Perhaps they've had antibiotics, perhaps they're on a processed diet, perhaps they're having flea and worming treatments, that kind of thing. What you'll generally find is that that one cell epithelial wall starts to become less integral, and that's where we start looking at I guess symptoms. I don't know what I would call leaky gut. I guess it's not a symptom, but I wouldn't gauge it as a disease either. It's a causation. So you've got leaky gut, and what happens is the integrity of that lining starts to go, so the less mucin is produced, the gut microbiota tends to go, lots of inflammation ensues in the gut, and the outer part, the extrinsic layer of that gut wall, stops producing as much gastric juices. And this is where I believe the problems start to begin, because this is a process that does happen, and to me this makes sense. I hope it makes sense to you too. So gastric juices are there for many reasons, and they're high levels and they're really strong acid pH, namely to be able to break down a really high protein and bone diet, or certainly a high protein diet. And it helps regulate the bad bacteria, the good bacteria. It helps to deal with pathogens and parasites. It helps extrapolate vitamins and minerals out of food. But the major thing that it does just in the stomach, that very first part of digestion, is it deals with the very first part of protein digestion and fat digestion. And this is where the issue starts to begin, because If your stomach cannot, and I say you because it's the same as us as it is for them, if the stomach is not able to produce enough gastric juices, that protein and fat metabolism within the stomach, that first part of digestion, is not going to be completed as successfully. And then it has to go on and be emptied into the duodenum. And that is where the pancreas would then release its enzymes. But the stomach's going to give instruction to the pancreas and say, hey dude, we need more enzymes here because we haven't done a very easy job here. We're lacking with the acids and the pepsin, and we're really struggling. You're going to have to do a little bit of extra work. Now, obviously, it's exacerbated by certain foods. It might be that your dog has reactivities and sensitivities to certain foods that can definitely trigger that response. It might be that there's not very good bacteria in the gut that definitely will help trigger a response. But that very first part of fat and protein digestion is the key bit that starts everything off. Now, quite often transit of food can just slow down a little bit, so it tends to sit in the gut a little bit longer in the stomach. And this is where you can easily get acid reflux, regurgitation and vomiting and that kind of thing. But also it then it's just a little slower being emptied into the duodenum, and then the pancreas has to work a little bit harder to digest all of those foods. If then you are actually feeding a dry food which has a really, really high carbohydrate content, to stick everything together, although it doesn't say on the dry food packet, to stick it all together, it has to have lots of starch added to it for the rendering and extrusion process. So you've got high carbohydrate content food with a dog that doesn't produce much amylase. So you can definitely see an issue there. And there's actually a proven thing, and this has happened in humans and it happens in dogs as well, and we know it, and it's an official response to a high carbohydrate diet that contains more than 50% carbohydrate, which is not uncommon in a dry food, and particularly for animals. This is more for humans. For animals, that should be far, far lower. You get something called carbohydrate-induced hypertriglyceridemia. That's the one. And we know that high levels of fat concentration in the blood are sparked from having high levels of carbohydrate in the diet. So that is why a lot on the conventional side think that a really high fat diet is going to spark an episode. Now, there are genetics at play, obviously, and I'm going to go through causation and all that, but ultimately you have a genetic blueprint. Your dog has a genetic blueprint. When you're born, you might have certain genetic mutations. Now, genetic mutations are really genetic codings, genes that aren't coding as efficiently as they should. Genes produce a protein that allows for a biochemical pathway to occur in the body. So genes make up who we are and what we look like and how we function, and it produces immune cells and skin cells and hair cells, eye colour, pancreatic cells, enzymes. It will help with all of that process. And if there's anything in the programming that isn't quite right with the genetics, then there is potential that obviously your dog is predisposed. However, I do believe it is a blueprint, and with a blueprint you can definitely work with and put in nutritional intervention to support them so that they don't carry on with these issues. Now, it's quite breed specific, but honestly, I see lots of different breeds of pancreatitis. So a really common one with exocrine pancreatic insufficiency is a German Shepherd, an Alsatian. And I would say probably for exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, it's well over 50% just in German. The cases are in German Shepherds, but that's not just German Shepherds. It could be Schnauzers, Mini Poodles are well known for it. Cocker Spaniels, really big one. I have a lot of Cocker Spaniels on my books with pancreatitis. And so there is a predisposition there, but there's a lot that we can do, and we're going to talk about food and supplementation. But the big thing for me is I want to talk about these factors that definitely work against or have factors, causation in developing or having a pancreatic episode. I think that's the main thing. So we spoke about genetics. There are obvious breeds that are involved, but it is not exhaustive. The biggest thing for me is digestion. If your dog has IBD, IBS, if there's just poor microbiota, if they have leaky gut, if that process that I've just spoken about, where the one cell epithelial becomes less integral, they start producing less gastric juices, the first part of fat and protein digestion becomes a little less ineffective, you start to see where this picture goes. You know, it's very much entwined. I can guarantee if somebody's coming to me with pancreatitis, their dog's got pancreatitis, I need to do some gut healing, and we need to go through a particular process of elimination to make sure that their dog's okay. It's a definite thing. We know that endotoxins from leaky gut syndrome can actually exacerbate pancreatitis. We know that just having an immune response in the gut is going to cause inflammation that will have a knock-on effect on the pancreas. You know, it's really important that they have good, fresh, appropriate food that's easily assimilated, and that gut integrity is really important. Now, I always talk about the 4 R's, and this is imperative with any digestive issues. And I'm going on about digestive issues because it's not completely exclusive to pancreatitis. It is because of the digestion and the impaction of maybe certain foods or other aspects that will be putting more pressure on the pancreas. And so we have to look to the digestive system to be working really, really well. So we know that obviously with inflammation ensuing, I just want to make sure I don't go down any rabbit holes here. My head's all over the place with all this information. So we know that IBS, IBD can be a really big instigator. So a big thing for me would obviously be with the 4 R's, you remove the triggers that might be triggering that response. So yes, there might be some fatty foods in there, because if the pancreas is actually inflamed at the time, you definitely want to take some pressure off, and it is harder for the pancreas to digest fat. We want to remove that for the interim, but we can definitely maybe look to introducing fatty foods as we go on. You then want to repair the gut lining, and when you repair that gut lining, it starts then producing more gastric juices. It's going to be a little bit kinder and won't ask the pancreas to do so much work. Also, the pancreas isn't going to be saying to the liver, can you help me out because I've got a finite amount of enzymes here. I need you to tell the gallbladder to produce more bile to shove into the intestines to help with the fat emulsification process. And this is where you then start to see that kind of yellowy, slimy kind of poo. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean there's pancreatitis, but you can see the link and the causation and how one organ system is going to ask another organ system. So, you know, digestion, if that's not working effectively, and I always say everything oscillates around the digestive system, if that is not working effectively, it's going to affect the pancreas, it's going to affect the liver, it's going to affect the gallbladder, and enter in systemic inflammation and other issues as well. So for me, digestion is key, and I'm going to talk about how we deal with that a little bit later. Infections are also a big trigger. There's Salmonella and Legionella as well. They've both shown to have a correlation and exacerbation. Salmonella, obviously, here's the thing, salmonella can be an issue with raw food with a really unwell dog. So what I always do, and don't get me wrong, I'm a raw foodie all the way, but if I have a really unwell dog that comes to me with a pancreatic flare, that's not doing too well, I do actually find putting in cooked food a little easier on the digestive system, and it also eliminates that pathogenic issue. They're not going to have really strong gastric juices, and those gastric juices are there to help filtrate all those parasites and pathogens and so on. So infection is obviously a trigger. Other endocrine diseases. Now, sometimes you might find diabetes, which is correlated to the pancreas because it releases insulin. That can also then have an impact on pancreatitis. So you normally find the two can come hand in hand. One comes before the other or after, either or. They're endocrine diseases because obviously the pancreas is part of the endocrine system producing insulin and glucagon and so on. So it has its connectivity to other parts of the body as well. So if there's impaction in one part, there's always going to be impaction somewhere else. It's like a domino effect. Toxins, biggest thing for me, toxins. When we are looking at the environment, when we're looking at genetics, when we're looking at the health of a body, we are looking at how the body interfaces with the environment. This includes nutrition, which we're going to cover. It includes toxins, and it includes stress. Now, toxins is a massive one because toxins in your flea and worming treatment, in your vaccinations, they will drive a response, a Th2 response, which number one is inflammatory, which can obviously trigger inflammation in a part of the body that's struggling anyway. But equally, it can switch genes on, it can interfere with genetic coding. So it is really important that we try and live toxin-free life in the house for the dog, for us and for them. Even radiation impacts. You want to be having natural products in the home, try and avoid bleach, all of these things. They are all triggers to many, many diseases. And whilst I'm not saying toxins are the only thing that's responsible, it plays a big picture in what's happening to your pet, and it puts a huge amount of strain on your pet. Particularly when they're unwell. So you want to strip all of that back, get rid of it, and try and ease things a little bit. There are so many nice natural alternatives which we have. We have a blog on the website about flea and worming, and also about vaccination schedules. You don't need to keep vaccinating. If your dog has pancreatitis, they are an unwell dog. In the DHP guidelines, which are the core vaccines, which they call boosters, that they're supposedly having every year, the DHP guidelines say never vaccinate an unwell dog. I cannot tell you the amount of dogs I see who are unwell. They were unwell before they came to see me. They got a little bit better, but still not well in terms of presenting without symptoms, but they still have these underlying issues. They don't necessarily just suddenly disappear out of nowhere. If it's happened once, if you don't look after things, it could happen again. So we shouldn't be vaccinating a dog that is unwell, whatever your vet deems unwell. Medications can also be a trigger. Steroids is a massive one. I deal with allergies a lot, and I know there's the Apoquel and the Cytopoint, but steroids seems to be a really big one, or steroids for other means, and dogs are left on it for too long. That has a massive impact on the entire system, but it's not uncommon to end up with acute and chronic pancreatitis. The chronic pancreatitis normally ends up turning into exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, and then quite often you're at a point of no return. And I don't mean that as in you've got an unwell dog for life and there's nothing you can do. Completely the opposite. But there is definite ways that you can support your dog, and it's really, really important that if you can avoid those interventions, or if you haven't looked at other means, or your dog has been on certain medications, steroids, omeprazole is an issue for me, because what omeprazole does, it's a proton pump inhibitor. It stops the proton pumps, those little glands that are within that one cell epithelial, from producing gastric juices, and that's already an issue. They're not producing enough, but what they're doing is they're dampening that down more so that you haven't got this reflux and regurgitation going on, because there's no acid there sitting in the stomach. But this is only going to make the pancreatitis worse, because it's saying, well, I've done even less of a complete job of digesting the food in the stomach, so the pancreas needs to help me even more now. So the whole omeprazole thing with pancreatitis just really gets on my pip. Okay, so omeprazole. Back issues. I actually, I don't know much about it. But it's to do with the, there's a part of the, kind of at the bottom of the ribs. So where does it meet? It's between the thoracic and the lumbar vertebrae. And if there's any kind of impaction, if there's some trauma around there, I guess really it's more to do with trauma. Or if there might a fusing of the vertebrae, that can obviously cause damage to the pancreas. But I think that's actually quite rare, but I thought I'd throw that in there. Stress. Stress is a really big one. And I know I say this every single time, but I just don't think you can ever underestimate how stressful it is for a dog to live in a 21st century home. It must be really confusing. I think it's stressful for us. We've got so much going on, and TV and music, and you've got the Wi-Fi, and there's radiation, and there's probably kids in the house, and everybody's like tearing around, making noise. They're trying to make out what the television is, the doorbell's ringing, someone's coming up to the house, and then they've got to go out, but they're on a lead, and it's a joy. And honestly, I'm not making out like every dog's just stressed to the hilt just living in the house, but I'm just saying it is a weird situation, I guess, for a dog to be in sometimes. And so I always say it's really important to try and help regulate stress, because whilst that's not going to be the sole thing that's going to cause pancreatitis, it's definitely a trigger if your dog has some form of pancreatitis or has previously had a flare. Obviously, exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, you do not want to be putting your dog under any unnecessary stress if it's avoidable. So those are the main, I guess, causations, factors that are involved in the pancreatitis and what can make it worse. I kind of feel like I've got into the flow a little bit. I'm sorry if I was a bit all over the place earlier. Anyway, so that then takes you on to food. So I spoke about the dry food, the high carbohydrate content, and it's so incredibly important to feed a fresh diet and a really good protein and fat diet with not that many carbohydrates in there. This idea of lots of starch containing products and grains and things like that, it's not, a dog genuinely isn't equipped to be digesting that kind of a food. And whilst you might be told to feed chicken and rice, if they've had a flare and obviously really bad digestive system and so on, the rice, yes, at the time is a mucilage, so it can actually create a nice little film around the digestive tract. But long term, something like rice ultimately only upregulates something called zonulin, which will cause more inflammation and leaky gut, which is that lack of integrity to the gut mucosa, which the gut lining, which will obviously impact all of the digestion. Yeah, I'm really funny. Dry foods they generally will contain anywhere between, I think the lowest is 18%. I know. Carla, I'm really sorry, Carla. I didn't mention Carla joining the team. That is so rude. I'm sorry. I was so caught up in stuff at the very beginning. Carla has written a really great thing on dry foods and how much carbohydrate a lot of the really common foods actually contain. And she shared that on our site too. Carla, I'm so sorry. That's so rude. Carla is such a valued member who's offering the Optimize, helping people who genuinely don't know which way to turn and putting them onto the right track. So I think if you can keep the carbohydrates down and knock dry food on the head, it's a wonderful thing to do. I always do, as I say, a lightly cooked food when they come to me in a flare. It's by far easier. Even if you're a raw foodie, it doesn't mean they're not going back onto raw food, but it does, honestly, it really helps. So the main thing is actually falling onto something that works quite well. And again, you know, and I guess I tend to hit this protocol quite often, but it works so well. I go through a process of elimination, and I often start with a novel protein that's lean. So a novel protein is one that they won't have seen before. So horse, goat, if it's the lean part of the goat. Now, the very important part is it does need to be lean to begin with, because there will be lots of inflammation there. You really want to take the stress away from the pancreas. So I would go through a process of elimination, most definitely. I would also maybe just settle on a cooked food that they seem okay with, maybe for about 6 weeks, and just let things really calm down. And that's when I then look to the 4 R's, which is remove, repair, restore, and replenish. And replenish is a really, really big one. So when you repair, you're healing the gut mucosa. When you restore, you're putting in the good bacteria, which is incredibly important. But when you're replenishing, you're actually putting in digestive enzymes. Now, whilst, you know, if you've got a healthy dog, you might not necessarily need to do that. There's always this idea that it works on a feedback system. So if you put in enzymes, they might not produce enzymes. That's not research. It's not proven. I think maybe it wouldn't make much of a difference necessarily. But I think the really important thing is when you are going through that process of healing, what you really need to do is go through that exact process. So you remove the foods, you heal the gut lining, you restore it with the bacteria. And once you've done those things, and you've maybe done that for 4 to 6 weeks, that's when I put in the enzymes. And the only reason I don't put in enzymes before that, and they would just be capsules, digestive enzyme capsules, I don't put it in before, is because quite often pancreatitis cases are also presenting with IBS and IBD. It's very rare that they don't come with IBD of some sort. So lots of inflammation in the intestines, the gut mucosa's obviously compromised. Now, it's so important to make sure that that gut lining is protected and that you're not throwing in enzymes to really inflamed intestines that might even, you don't know if there are ulcers there, if there's colitis, then obviously if it's ulcerative colitis, that's a big problem. Enzymes can really irritate tissue because obviously they digest protein. So you have to be really careful. You don't just throw them in willy-nilly. And I think it's really important to use a certain kind of digestive enzyme. There are very few doggy ones that I like. They're always flavoured and I don't find them that effective, if I'm really honest. There's a couple in America, but in the UK I quite often recommend Bioenzyme by BioCare. I like vegetarian and vegan based. Quite often, if you've got a really sensitive dog, it can be from a meat source or it could be from dairy. So you want something that hopefully isn't going to also cause some kind of trigger. So you have to be very careful what you put in. The actual gut healing that takes place, and I guess this is where we go into the supplement territory, I always go for slippery elm, L-glutamine on occasion, deglycerized licorice, marshmallow root, aloe vera extract, all those lovely things that we know have mucilage effect. They protect the gut mucosa, they help with the lining, they help heal the gut lining, and it regulates those gastric juices produced by the lining. And that's a real key bit in all of this, is that it can actually help soothe pancreatitis inadvertently, because you're helping to relieve some of that pressure and that lack of integrity in the gut, which is obviously then giving the pancreas a little bit of a break. Very keen on that. There's quite a few products out there. Greens for Healthy Pets actually have quite a few different digestive enzymes. They do have bioenzyme, but they have quite a few different slippery elms. And then we go on to bacteria as well. It's really important to replenish and make sure that the gut microbiota is good, so that there's obviously less we're addressing the microbiota, which will obviously help with the inflammation. We know that poor gut microbiota and leaky gut can actually exacerbate pancreatitis, so that's incredibly important to address that. It's also going to help reduce IBS, IBD type symptoms, whilst you've also removed some of those protein triggers and sometimes non-protein triggers. So we've touched on enzymes. Calmatives, herbs can be really lovely. Chamomile and lemon balm. I quite often just suggest getting a tea so that you're not going heavy on herbs. Chamomile tea, cooled, is really lovely and can really help that initial kind of acute discomfort, because sometimes with that will also come a real distended stomach and a gassy stomach, and it can be really soothing. Equally with lemon balm, you can get lemon balm tea as well. That's really nice. Omega-3s, as long as you know, and maybe it's something that you add in after a few weeks, but omega-3s are great for inflammation. They help regulate that inflammatory response. So we're talking sardines, anchovies, mackerel. You can get them in oil form. You could go algae, you could do krill, anything that you think would suit your dog, and obviously go into it carefully so you're not triggering another reaction to something. But that can ultimately really help with the inflammation of the pancreas itself as well. And regulating stress is a really big one. I quite often, if it seems to be a big trigger and it's a dog that experiences a lot of stress, I definitely look to certain herbs that will help with that, like ashwagandha and rhodiola. You might want to speak to a herbalist or a professional about it, but they're quite nice and easy to use, and they can really help regulate the stress response. I also look at B complex, quite often a methylated B complex. Now, I don't necessarily just throw that in willy-nilly, but what I often find with pancreatitis is there's gut inflammation, and quite often B12 is low. If there hasn't been testing for that previously, which really your vet should be testing for B9, B12 when there's pancreatitis. B12 is inevitably low in a lot of cases. It's very rare that it's not. And equally, B9 can often present quite high, and that can often show that there's SIBO, which is a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which of course kind of makes sense when the integrity of the gut and the bad bacteria ensues over the good bacteria, and there's inflammation, and there's lots of reactivity to foods and so forth. yeah, it can really, really impact. And I think finally, I would check for vitamin D. Vitamin D is quite often low. Vitamin D is often low with a lot of dogs, but it's a good one to check. But I would definitely check for B12. And actually, there's a B12 product that I quite often recommend, which is a nice gentle liquid from BioCare. So I'm going to leave you guys to it. I'm sorry I've really waffled, as per usual.